Yep, we'll shut the.
I think we
Nice.
should shut that off.
Here, if I usually like to go into this mode just so I have a little more real estate. Okay, what's the question? Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let me grab my tea. So I'm not sure if there's, other than just varying the vocabulary, I'm not sure if there's any actual significance. I've never considered that. At the same time, that will factor into a little bit of what we want to mention in terms of the Judges cycle. That said, we're in Judges, and the good thing about Judges is a lot happening in this book. This is a hard book to get bored in. The problem is, at the same time as there being, well, a lot of action happening, a lot of it is some pretty troubling material. And so that's why it's probably a good thing that we didn't finish with Judges, but we continued and pushed on through Ruth, because Ruth is going to be a little bit more of a pleasant book in order to cleanse the palate, as it were. That said, I do also think beyond just pleasantness, there is another reason to really combine Judges and Ruth. And I want to get to that a little bit here and also highlight that as we get to the end of the story and talk through the ending of Judges and the ending of Ruth. That said, when we talk about Judges, Judges really is the transition book. It's the book that is going to take us in the history of Israel from the end of the conquest and the end of Joshua up to the rise of the Israelite monarchy. And there's really, we don't know for sure who the author of Judges is traditionally, and I would say we can probably say with some confidence, I think Samuel is behind this book as well. I think this is probably Samuel behind Judges. And one of the real emphases of Judges, and it's a horrific book, as you well know now, is the need for a king. You have the common refrain throughout all of Judges, really reaching its climax with the very end of the book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And this really goes to the sense in Judges in that what's happening in Judges is not an endorsement of how the Israelites are acting. In fact, very much the response you're supposed to be getting out of Judges is one of absolute horror at what exactly is transpiring in an Israel that has no king. Now, we say that, but during this period, if we follow the logic that really has been maintained since the time of the Exodus, who is the king in Israel during the period of the Judges?
God.
What did I hear it? What was that?
God.
God is the king in Israel during. There we go, Joe. Thank you. God is absolutely the king of Israel during this period. The problem is, as you can well see from the book of Judges, people aren't really giving too much to God. And so when God goes without heed and people start doing what is right in their own eyes, then we see that there is in fact no king in practice in Israel. Everyone's just doing what is right in their own eyes. And there's a real expectation and desire to see fulfilled that which Moses had predicted back in Deuteronomy, that after some time, the Israelites would grumble and desire a king for themselves, just like the surrounding nations. And Judges is really anticipating that movement, which we're going to see in Samuel. That said, when we're looking at, and I'll say more about this later, but I'll go ahead and say it now, especially if we follow Judges. And by the time you get to the end of Judges, things are really going off the rails, to say the least. Things are happening that are utterly horrific. And that really, I think you need to take in combination. It's why I think it's useful that Judges and Ruth are placed together in our Bibles with the real incredible story of loyalty and faithfulness that we see in the story of Ruth. Those two things are put side by side for a reason. And I think especially if we're looking at this in the context of anticipating the rise of the Israelite monarchy, and we look at that ending story in Judges, about Gibeah and the Levite's concubine and the real destruction of the tribe of Benjamin, you need to tie that with Saul, who is coming from the tribe of Benjamin, and combine that with the story of Ruth, which tells the story of the ancestors of David. You have here really told right before we get into Samuel, the story of the background of where Saul and his people are coming from, put side by side with the story of where David is coming from. And I think if we look at both stories, we know generally which one we prefer. With that said, a little bit of a statement on who a judge is. Remember back in Deuteronomy, and I mentioned this as we went through Deuteronomy, judges were the ones who were set up by Moses in order to be present in the different parts of Israel, really establish justice, not be corrupt or take bribes, but the people would hear cases and deliver and decide justice in the land, much in the same way as we think of a judge acting. And this is an incredibly important role because the people who are going to most need justice, most need somebody who's going to step in like this, are going to be the poor and the people who can't really defend themselves in a society that isn't very well organized, doesn't have a lot of structure to it. Well, at least there's these judges who can provide justice. The thing is, and it's almost a little bit of a testament to just how chaotic things are getting in this period, we don't really see a lot of the judges in the book of Judges really fulfilling the role that's laid out in Deuteronomy. In fact, what we see a lot more of are the judges really playing the role of military deliverers, military leaders who are rising up and leading Israel into war. That's more of what we're seeing here in Judges. And one of the ways you can really think about judges is as tribal or regional chieftains who are going to reign for usually a period of about 40 years. And there's a little bit of word of caution and a reminder here, just because with the way Judges is told, it might be very easy for us to view Judges as sort of essentially a king in all but name. The thing you have to remember is the judges are really very regional in the area that they're ruling. You might have in the book of Judges, say Samson and Jephthah, both operating at the same time in different parts of Israel. These judges are not ruling over the entirety of Israel as Saul, David, and Solomon will. There probably is some significant overlap between the stories of the judges. So don't take the book of Judges as a chronological story. In fact, I think there's something a lot more clever going on in terms with how we're organizing the book of Judges, because it's really trying to tell a story, and not at all a pleasant story, about just how badly things are going as Israel spends these early years in the land. That brings us to something I imagine many of you have heard before, but it's called the Judges cycle. And when we look at the story in the book of Judges, and I brought up a few other cycles so far as we've been moving through the Old Testament, Judges really follows this clear cyclical pattern surrounding the rise of the judges and the unfaithfulness of Israel. I've seen this presented in a few different ways. The way I've been taught from my mentor and the people who taught me, kind of remembered with this, I can't even think of the name right now, this mnemonic device, Rock Doctor, ROCDR. Rock Doctor, this is how you can remember, just remembering that rock here is without a K. Rock Doctor is how you can remember the steps of the judges cycle. And the way it goes is first you have rebellion. This is the R in rock. Rebellion, where the people step out and they do what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. That leads us to oppression. After the people rebel, they go after the Baals and the Asheroth, and they start worshiping false gods and doing evil. Then God sells them or gives them into the hands of their enemies. Could be the Philistines, could be the Ammonites, just somebody. Once the Israelites turn away and are not faithful, as per the terms of the covenant, they will be delivered into the hands of one of their enemies. After that happens, well, the Israelites are going to cry out to the Lord because they'll be looking for mercy after that happens. So the rock part, you have rebellion, the oppression, and then in response, the cry out to the Lord. And once they cry out to the Lord, here, let me move this up so that it's not in the way. After you have the people cry out to the Lord, then the Lord hears their cry and God raises up a judge in order to deliver them. And then after the judge rises up, confronts the danger, leads the people of Israel against them, then you have a period of rest for a certain number of years. And the land is given rest and the people are given rest. And usually the judge rules through a good chunk of that period. Of course, it's a cycle. So after you have that rest, then inevitably, after things are going well for a little while, the Israelites lead back into rebellion, and then the whole thing starts up again. And it really is just, I think, a real lesson. The reason why Judges is formatted this way is because it's a real lesson, number one, of the futility of just how bad things are getting. And really, I think to a certain degree, if you've read Judges, a cycle might be a little bit deceptive because as you proceed through the book, it really isn't just a cycle. This isn't just going in circles. This is really a downward spiral because as we continue through this story, things just seem to be getting worse and worse. And so you have this story of this futility and things just, eventually the people do the wrong thing and then they cry out to the Lord after he's delivered them into the hands of their enemies. And then the Lord remains faithful, raises up a judge, and then the whole thing just keeps on going over and over again. It's a testament, one, to just how unfaithful the Israelites are now that they're living in the promised land. And number two, to just how faithful God is. But just to illustrate this cycle, one of the smaller examples of this cycle we can follow is in Judges chapter 3, and that's with what we've talked about a little bit already, the story of Ehud. And so in Ehud, beginning in Judges 3, verse 12, if I can read in my low light situation, and the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon. Here, I'll pull out my own device and take care of the light myself. There we go. That'll help. Here, so I'm not shining a light in the camera of the phone. I got it. I think this will be able to suffice. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strength. So you have right there in the beginning of verse 12, people once again do evil. You have the rebellion. And what does the Lord do? Well, the Lord strengthens Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. So there you go, Eglon the Fat, well known for being a very, very large man, is the one who is going to subdue and conquer the Israelites. And of course, it's funny to us, and it's fortunate because it makes the story quite memorable, that Eglon is this very, very large dude. However, it's important, of course, to recognize in the context of some of the cultural things going on in this story, if you had a fat king, that was not, as is our culture, where you want to be svelte and muscular. This was not a bad thing for Eglon to be fat. The fact that Eglon could be fat indicated that he was an incredibly prosperous king and that things were going very well for him. So when we hear Eglon the Fat, we go, that's real funny. But when the Israelites, when the actual intended, the original audience of this story hears Eglon the Fat, they hear, here is a king who clearly is having a lot of success, a real force to be reckoned with. And so the question is, how is Eglon the Fat going to be defeated? Well, we get to it immediately in verse 15. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They cry out to the Lord. Here's the next step in the cycle. And the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Interesting that we bring up the left-handed distinction. Notice what Pastor Michael said a little bit earlier, just in the sense of a lot of these judges seem to be people who are maybe not necessarily outcasts from society, but people who are not considered the ideal person or have something about them that is considered a little out of the ordinary. I don't think being left-handed is really that serious of a condition or something we should look at as being bad. Apologies to any left-handed people in the room. Your oppression is not fairly put upon you. Nevertheless, Ehud is going to have this difference about him that the Lord is going to be able to use to deliver the people of Israel. And Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And here's, if you're anticipating, where the left-handed nature of Ehud is going to come into play. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back to the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he commanded silence. And all his attendants went out from his presence. So Eglon, Ehud's able to get Eglon alone. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone and in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat, and Ehud reached with his left hand and took the sword with his right thigh and thrust it into his belly. And what's really being indicated here is because Ehud is left-handed, that he is able to hide this weapon. And so it's the left-handedness of Ehud that's used to deliver the people of Israel here. Ehud reached from his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly, and the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and the tongue came out. Way too much information here. Nevertheless, you have the fatness of Eglon being juxtaposed against the left-handedness of Ehud, and all of these character traits which are being brought up really being used for this unlikely delivery of Israel. Then Ehud went out to the porch and closed the doors of the roof behind him and locked them. And I want to stop right there for a second, because depending upon your translation, if you have ESV or NIV, you probably see there the translation porch. And I think if your Bible's like mine, you have a little footnote that says the meaning of the Hebrew word is uncertain. I actually think, any NLT users in the room? What does your NLT say here? Because this is where I'm gonna say I think the NLT gets this right, where most other translations get it wrong. You can find it, not to put you on the spot.
Spotlight.
Literally a spotlight right on top of you. We're Judges 3:24. Yep. 23 we're still in. 24 is the next. Oh, interesting. Your NLT still has porch. All right. I don't know if anyone has NLT or a newer NLT. Nevertheless, I'm looking to give the NLT here its moment in the sun. Okay. I need to wait here too long, but
Keep going.
okay. Well, this is an important point. Nevertheless, I'll say I'll go ahead and give it away. I wanted, for anyone who's using the NLT, I've said that you shouldn't be ashamed. What is it, Connor? The latrine. I think what some translations are going to translate porch or vestibule. I think the NLT gets it right here when it says latrine. So you actually have here and another additional, maybe gross detail of the story of Judges and the story of Ehud. The reason why he's going to escape and the other people aren't going to realize what happens is because Ehud, rather than leaving through the front door, is going to dip down the latrine. And you kind of have a Shawshank Redemption type situation there, where Ehud is crawling through the muck in order to get away from the situation. Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Seirah. And when he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your hands the Moabites into your hand. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So there you go. There's the deliverance through unlikely circumstances of Israel from the Moabites, whose hand they had been delivered into, Eglon the Fat. And they are delivered after they cried out. And in verse 30, so Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. And that brings us through there, just in one chapter, the entirety of one cycle of the Judges cycle. Bless you. So there you go. There's, in the story of Ehud, what the Judges cycle looks like. Now, a little bit of a crash course, just because this is kind of one of those cultural things that I think is, you can get a little bit more out of the Old Testament if you're aware of some of these things. But what a threshing floor is, and specifically how the grain harvest is really working here in Israel. The way you harvest grain is, you have sheets of grain, and you start by taking the sheets, and you take a sickle and you cut them down, and you cut down the sheets of grain. Then what you do is you lay them all out in an open space called a threshing floor. And typically, you want to set your threshing floors at the top, at the peak of a level location at the top of a hill or a mountain. That way, there's a lot of wind around, because what you're going to do is you're going to lay these sheets on the ground, and you're going to bring out a large animal with this threshing sledge here. And what you're going to do is you're going to crush the grain so that the kernel, the wheat and the chaff, the actual wheat kernel, what you want, and the chaff separate under the wheat. And then what you're going to do, the reason why you want it to be on a windy location is because then, if you see this picture, he's a little bit obscured by our people in Zoom land. You see this guy with the winnowing fork, and he's going to take the wheat that's been crushed by the threshing sledge, and he's going to just toss it up in the air. Just keep tossing it. And with the wind, the lighter chaff is going to get blown away, and the heavy stuff that falls to the ground is going to be those kernels of wheat that you actually want. And this is how you're able to process your wheat. Was there something in Zoom, a comment from Zoomland? I want to make sure I'm giving my Zoomers their due. But this is how generally the threshing system is going to work. And it actually ends up being an important initial piece of information when we're looking at the story of Gideon, because one of the things we hear about from Gideon in chapter 6 is that things are not going well. In fact, the Midianites are really subjugating the Israelites. And one of the things we hear is that Gideon is threshing in a wine press. What this means is, rather than threshing on a high place where it's very windy, you're threshing in secret, which makes it, one, much harder, because now you don't have the wind helping you out in order to blow things away. Why are they doing this? Well, because when you're at the top of a large hill and you're threshing and you're winnowing and threshing the grain, there actually is, first of all, you're at the top of a high place. You're very easily seen. And you can actually, if you're threshing enough grain, it does create kind of a cloud that goes away. And you can see it for miles. And so one of the things that we're told is happening is when the Midianites see all of this, see that the Israelites are threshing their grain, they just show up and they take it. And so because Israel is in such a weak situation, here's Gideon in this real situation of weakness, needing to thresh in a wine press, which is not only hard work, but it's a real humiliation. And the fact that God's people who are living in their land are not able to use it to its full extent, which is why it's a little bit surprising when the angel shows up to Gideon in verse 12, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." And so that's a little bit of humor, dry humor going on in the Bible, because here's Gideon kind of sheepishly and hiding and trying to thresh his grain without the Midianites coming upon him. And then the angel comes up and says, "Gideon, you mighty man of valor." And so there's a little bit of a stark contrast here where the angel is saying, Gideon, you are a mighty man of valor, when in truth, the moment he's catching Gideon, Gideon is kind of cowering away. And that leads us to one of the interesting moments in Judges that again has to do with the way that the land functions, in the sense that when Gideon is told all of this message, that he is going to be the one who's raised up the judge who delivers Israel from Midian, Gideon decides to test God. And again, this is another one of those cases where I don't think Gideon is supposed to be held up as an example of what we're supposed to do. It's just, here's an indication of Gideon testing the Lord. And Gideon, for all to say this, even though I'm saying Gideon is maybe not doing the right thing here, compared to the rest of the book of Judges, Gideon is probably the high point. Like, if the worst we're talking about Gideon is he kind of tested the Lord a little bit more than he probably should have, that's a pretty good statement on Gideon. But what Gideon does is he asks the Lord, he says, I'm going to put out a fleece. And as the night goes on, overnight, the dews will come through Israel. And it's very important because during certain times of the year in Israel, as I sort of brought up earlier, there's not a lot of rain. The only thing that's really going to bring moisture and water to the land are these dews that come in as the warmer air from the sea meets the cold land. And it leaves behind that dew. And what you would expect to have happen if you leave a fleece is, the fleece is going to act like a sponge. The dew is going to go into the ground, but the fleece, since it's like a sponge, is going to hold on to that moisture. So it's actually kind of exactly what we would expect to have happen that Gideon requests, to say, I want just the fleece to be wet and everything else to be dry. And it's maybe a little bit of a foolish moment on Gideon, and it's why Gideon immediately after asked, all right, God, you did that for me, but that's kind of what was supposed to happen anyway. So now it's time for you to do the really impressive thing, which is everything's wet, but the fleece is dry. That would be a real miracle. And so this happens again, and the Lord is patient with Gideon and does what he's asked. And you would not expect, if everything's wet, the fleece, which is going to soak up moisture, is definitely supposed to be wet. Nevertheless, it's dry. Yeah.
I never interpreted that as a challenge to God. I interpreted it that Gideon was looking for God's will earnestly.
I think there's something to really dig into here. And again, I think it's why, if this is one of the worst, if this is if this is pretty much as bad as bad of a challenge as we're gonna levy against Gideon at this point, then that kind of speaks pretty well to Gideon, especially compared to who he's put side by side with in the book of Judges. There really is a command in the Bible: don't put the Lord your God to a test. And I think when we're looking at this whole business with the fleece, I think if we were going to say Gideon did the best thing he could have done, he would have trusted the word of the Lord that was given to him and gone and done his job. And the fact that we're having to wait here and go through this ordeal with the fleece and everything, I don't think this is, even though God's not going to react poorly to it, I don't think it's the most beneficial, best thing that Gideon could have done at this time. And it actually shows some patience and mercy by God that he's going to wait through this whole ordeal with the fleece. Nevertheless, that brings us to the story of Gideon, which I would have to say, if I were to pick out my favorite story in Judges, I think Gideon wins it. And that is because in Gideon, you have the story of Gideon and his 300 men. It's the original story of the 300. We've heard about the battle with the Spartans. This is, Gideon had it first. This is the first battle with 300. And the real emphasis here on this story is God getting the victory, because initially, when Gideon shows up in chapter 7, verse 2, there's just too many warriors. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Because what God's making it clear is Israel's not going to win the battle on its own. God is going to be the one. I'm going to be the one to deliver Israel during this time. And so these are just too many warriors. If you win the battle this way, Gideon, all that's going to happen is Israel is going to say, look how powerful we are. And it's going to end up leading to a worse situation. So what God says to Gideon to do is just go to all those people, go to your men, and anyone who's afraid, anyone who's feeling a little scared or a little apprehensive about this battle, just send them. Just let them go home. Which you can imagine is going to be a good number of them. And after he does that, there's still a little bit too many men for God's comfort. So he decides, go down. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the test. We're going to
Recorded,
go
okay.
and we're going to go down to the river, and all of your men are going to get a drink because it's real hot and they've been out in the heat for a while. And what you're going to do is all of those men who stick their head right into the water and drink it up, those men, send them home. The people you want to keep are the people who kneel down at the river and stay alert, keep their head up, and bring the water to themselves. And you might argue here, is this Gideon kind of like he's separating out the men who are in good shape or the people who are alert and the good warriors? I don't really think that's what's fitting into the context of the story, because the emphasis here is it's not the fact that there's a few good warriors. It's the fact that compared to what Israel could have had, you only have 300 men. And the emphasis is on God is the one who's going to deliver them, not the Israelites. We're not going to put the Israelites in a position where they think that they are the ones who are really winning it. And so after he does all this, we're down to just 300 men. And then that brings us to the climactic victory of Gideon in 7:19. And he said, they were my brothers, the sons of, wait, where? Oh, I jumped to 8:19, sorry. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came out to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, and they had just set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands to make a big crash. Then the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches, and their right hands the trumpets to blow, and they cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran in. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beit Shittah, towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah and Tabath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. And so you have this complete victory here, but the emphasis being on not Gideon winning the battle, not Israel winning the battle, but God winning the battle. Next story I need to talk about, and recognizing I'm not going to get time to talk about all of the events in Judges, especially I will apologize now. I have had Samson hit the editing room floor. I think Samson's pretty well known, and you can enjoy Samson. I've said a little bit about him already in terms of his connection to the Nazirite vow and some of what's going on. I think when we look at Samson, the thing that probably most surprises us is the fact that Samson, the part we don't usually get told in the Sunday school version, Samson's not a great guy. And part of that, I think, goes to, I mentioned Gideon kind of being a little bit of a high mark, especially the victory here with Gideon, a little bit of a high mark in Judges. After Gideon is when you're really going to start the slide. And this is when you start to get some of these real stories that are starting to trouble us or start to tune us into the fact that things are not going well. And I think Jephthah definitely probably is going to end up towards the top of the list of things that are really, really bothering us in the book of Judges. And so in Judges 10:14, just an interesting verse to pull out, Judges chapter 10, verse 14. God is going to use a little sarcasm in this passage because the Israelites are once again going after false gods and idols. And when they cry out to the Lord, God's actually getting a little fed up with it all. And so in 10:14, he gets a little snarky and he says, go and cry out to the gods whom you've chosen. Let them save you in their time of distress. Go ahead and see if they're going to help you out here. So just some illustration in the context. We can clearly see what God is saying in the sense that those gods are not real. If you cry out to them, not a lot is going to happen to you. Nevertheless, you see this statement in Scripture. Just a reminder, we need to always read within context. You need to use context to interpret. Now, this is the big thing when we get to Jephthah in terms of what Jephthah does is he raises up and he tries to become the deliverer of Israel. But in the process, he ends up making a little bit of a tragic vow. Chapter 11, verse 30. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. And of course, what turns out to be the thing that actually comes out the door to greet him? His daughter, his only the only daughter, the only offspring that he has. And I think here, really, especially if we compare this with some of the great teachings in Ecclesiastes, what you have here is somebody who's really making far too hasty and far too extreme of a vow. Ecclesiastes is very clear. If you make a vow like this to the Lord, don't do it in haste. This is something to be taken very seriously. In fact, you should probably at all times try and avoid making a vow like this. And Jephthah is going to be a pretty clear indicator of that. Nevertheless, here, I'm actually going to step in. And one of my teachers really pushed back on the idea that what we have is a burnt offering, where actually we have Jephthah lights his daughter up in fire and offers her as a burnt sacrifice to the Lord. I'm not sure and recognize the majority of Old Testament scholars who read this passage are going to say, yes, it's horrific, it's horrible, but that really does seem to be what happened. Is Jephthah, as I think most of us assume when we read through this passage, is in fact sacrificing in a burnt offering his own daughter. We have human sacrifice going on to the Lord. The interesting thing here, though, is I think if we really dig into some of the details of this passage, we might not have to say that that's exactly what's going on. And I think there's a few details in the story that really clue us into that, because when Jephthah breaks the news to his daughter reacts kind of strangely in the sense that what she's upset about is not the fact that she states that she's about to die, but the fact that she will never marry. And I think the big thing we immediately have to think about is, well, if you're not going to, if you're about to die, why is not getting married the thing that's really at the top of your mind? The fact that you're going to die a virgin. And so one of the things I will suggest to you is perhaps what actually happens here is that Jephthah is not being sacrificed, but rather that Jephthah's daughter is getting dedicated to the Lord. That makes a lot more sense. If she's not getting killed, but rather she's being dedicated in some of the ways that we can see parallels and indications of how this happens back in Numbers 8:11. It makes a lot more sense if Jephthah's daughter is upset, I'm never going to marry, I'll die a virgin, I won't have any children. That's makes more sense if she's not actually going to die. She's simply going to be dedicated to the Lord in such a way that will preclude her from ever being able to fulfill these roles. And I think actually, if we, and I pulled that up a little early, one of the things we can keep in mind is that in Hebrew, when we read the word and, it can actually also be translated. Conjunctions are a little bit generalized in Hebrew, and we can also translate and as or. Now recognize, of course, just to recognize this doubt, none of your translations have decided to do this. However, if we take that up and we read Jephthah's vow in chapter 11, verse 31, and 30 and 31, and Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out of the doors of my house to me when I return in peace with the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, or I will offer it up for a burnt offering. And when you read it that way, then all of a sudden you see that alternative of, well, if this is a human, we're not sacrificing it to the Lord, we're dedicating it to the Lord. But if the first thing that comes out to me is, say, some livestock, then that will be burnt up, because we're not dedicating animals to the Lord. Only the way we do that is through burnt offerings. So I think here maybe this is what spares us some of the real grossness and the real trouble of, is this an example here in this story of human sacrifice to God? It could be. And if it is, then it's absolutely a sign of just how far off the beaten path, far off of the desire of God, the Israelites have gone in taking hasty vows with God and in here, offering human sacrifices even to God. But I think if we read it this way, yes, we still have that indication um, of hasty vows. And yes, we see that things aren't going well, but you avoid that. It still makes sense in the sense that the detail is included in the story that Jephthah's daughter is his only child, his only offspring. So it makes sense that she and Jephthah would both be extremely upset about this entire situation because this dedication to the Lord means, therefore, now Jephthah's line is going to be over, finished. There will be no descendants from him. And in a culture like this, that is a real serious disaster to befall you. But nevertheless, just to offer this alternative a little bit about Jephthah. Another thing just to mention quickly, because it's a good SAT term, even though I don't think the SAT vocabulary is quite difficult anymore, to my disappointment. Shibboleth. This is a great obscure vocab term that's coming directly out of the book of Judges, because Jephthah in his conflict with the Ephraimites is going to use a little bit of linguistic trickery in order to realize who his enemy is. And that's in chapter 12, verse 6. They said to him, well, actually, I'll begin in verse 5. And the Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites. And when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, "Let me go over," the men of Gilead said to them, "Are you an Ephraimite?" When they said, "No," they said to him, "Then say Shibboleth." And he said, Thibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. Then they seized him and slaughtered him in the fords of the Jordan. At that time, 42,000 Ephraimites died, fled or fell, excuse me. So a term for shibboleth, a vocab term, is anytime you have these insider terms or this insider way of speaking that distinguishes you from somebody else. In reference to this story in Shibboleth, in Judges, you have shibboleth because the Ephraimites, because they had a slightly different accent, kind of like we can think of a Boston accent versus a Southern accent. When they say car, they say ka. And so when the Ephraimites say shibboleth, they say sibboleth. And so when they hear that accent, you know that's an Ephraimite, and you can get it. Also, contextually, a little bit of an indication that Israel is far from, at this point, united as a people. And sort of speaking to that and bringing us towards the end of the book of Judges, I brought up this chart of kind of the basics of what I think you need to know about the geography of the tribes of Israel during this time. We mentioned the Philistines out on the coast. You have Ephraim in the north, Judah in the south, and Benjamin sandwiched in between. And I have it left over from our last slideshow. You have those three, East Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, all on the other side of the Jordan. Nevertheless, Ephraim, Benjamin, and Judah here are going to be important to the narrative, as well as the Philistines, because you'll remember Dan is going to be given the tribal allotment along the coast near where the Philistines are. And one of the things that's going to happen is in the book of Judges, as the Philistines are really proving a little bit too dangerous, Dan is going to pick up their things and they're going to run to the north and found the city of Dan. And that brings us to these last two tales of two Levites that are really going to leave us with some horrific horrific stories here at the end of Judges. First of all, the Levite that the Danites are going to pick up while they're traveling north to go found their new city where the Danites are going to live. And one of the things about this Levite had set up and created for himself an idol. You see here, the priests are starting to go bad. When you see not only these bad things happening, but Levites starting to do these things, it's a real sign that the degeneracy of Israel is starting to get pretty out of hand. And so the Danites are going to bring this guy with them, say, hey, you don't want to just be the priest of a small household. You can be the priest of this entire tribe, and you can take your idol with you, and we'll bring him up. And I think this is important context, because Here you have the city of Dan in its founding being really associated with this sense of idol worship. And that is going to be really important when we get into the story in Kings of the rise of Jeroboam, who is going to set up in the northern kingdom centers of idol worship, one of them in Dan, where he's going to set up a golden calf. He's going to set up a second golden calf. Does anyone remember where? It's in Bethel. Bethel, because that's the location where Jacob had experienced Jacob's ladder. And so what you have here in context, in historical context in Judges, is the real recognition that Dan, this far, far north location, kind of Dan runs up and becomes the far northern point of Israel as a city. The whole tribe just becomes one city. Dan is going to become one of the havens and the centers of this evil idol worship, and it's finding its foundations here. That brings us as well to the second horrific story of the Levite concubinage. And this is where things are going to finish off in a truly horrific note. And it begins with this situation where you have a Levite with a concubine, which means we're already in bad, we're already starting, we're at a bad start already. But it starts off with these two cities where the Levite is going to travel down to Bethlehem. Notice some of these terms leading us into the history in Samuel. Some of these places are starting to become a little bit significant in the sense that they are coming up. And they're traveling north. Remember, north is this way on the map. North from Bethlehem. They mentioned they don't want to stop at Jerusalem because Jerusalem is a Jebusite city at this point. So they don't want to stop there. So they travel north into Gibeah instead. And this is going to lead to the entire destruction, almost, of that tribe of Benjamin that's sandwiched between Ephraim in the north and Judah to the south. In the story, the Levite goes to Bethlehem, travels back, and in Gibeah, you have this story that really directly parallels Sodom and Gomorrah. If you are trying to paint a picture of things getting as bad as you can possibly imagine them getting, then drawing a direct parallel with Sodom and Gomorrah is probably the way you want to go about it. And here, it gets even worse. When the people show up and ask, can we let this come out so that we may know you or your guest? This time the guest comes out and you end up with the concubine being raped and killed in a horrific scene. And in response, the Levite ends up dividing and cutting up the concubine and sending the concubine in pieces to the other 12 tribes so that they can come to Gibeah and destroy and give retribution. And what you have is an entire tribe, almost, Benjamin, gets wiped out by this conflict that begins with this horrific situation in Gibeah. And in response, they almost wipe out Benjamin, but then they go, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to wipe out an entire tribe. But they don't have any wives anymore, and we need them to reproduce. Well, let's go to Jabesh Gilead, a city that didn't come and help us out in this situation, and let's just steal all of their wives, and then we'll give them to the Benjaminites. And there's going to be a few left over as well. So let's go to Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant is, and kidnap a bunch of people who are worshiping there. And this is completely out of hand. It's supposed to be bonkers. Notice, by the way, keep this in your mind. This is all, this story. Why is it including this story? Why is the Bible including stories that just completely go off the rails like this? I think you have to remember this association with Saul, because we're about to next week get into the story of Saul in Samuel. And when Saul is going to say, I belong to the smallest and the lowest of the tribes, the reason why he can say that is because, well, here you have the story of Benjamin almost getting completely wiped out. But on top of that, there's some additional connections in the sense that Saul is coming from Benjamin. Notice when you get into the story of Saul, what city, when he becomes king, he starts really setting his eyes on. It's Jabesh Gilead, and it has to do back to these connections. And so what you have here leading us into Samuel is some of the horrific background of what's going on with Saul and how, you know, his background and a lot of the tales of what was going on in Israel and what happened to the Benjaminites is pretty horrific. And that should inform some of the way that you look at Saul and what's driving him as a person and who he sees himself as. And remember, of course, Judges is going to finish with that refrain. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the book of Judges kind of just leaves you with that sick feeling in your mouth, what in your stomach of what just happened. Holy moly, this is what the Israelite people have become now that they're dwelling in the land. This is what's happening. It's supposed to have that impact. But then we've just looked at some of the background of Benjamin and the story of the background of Saul. That leads us into Ruth, which is a much, much more pleasant, hopeful story. And this is the story of the background of David. And so the background goes to a series of tragedies. You have a famine in the land, and I'll jump to the map. Notice Bethlehem's kind of down here in the south, right near south of Jerusalem. And when you have a drought, when you have a famine, you're going to want to travel to a place that is higher in elevation because you're going to get more rain there. And so where the people down in Bethlehem run up to is over to the east, up on the plains of Moab, which is higher up and higher elevated. So that's why you have the people down in Bethlehem running up to Moab, because they're trying to get to where the famine is not going to be as bad. Of course, the problem is husbands and sons do what husbands and sons are prone to do in a lot of biblical stories. They die. And so as a result, you have a situation where 3 women are really left alone in a society where it is really serious and really hard for a woman to be alone in this kind of a situation. By the way, just to say a little bit of the use of names in Ruth, when you look into Hebrew names, there's oftentimes a lot of significance here. Elimelech. Elimelech means El, Eli, Melech. El is king. God is king. So it's that real illustration of faithfulness. But then you have Mahlon and Chilion, and they mean sickly and weak. And so that's why the 2 people who die, their name in Hebrew is sickly and weak. Then you have Naomi, whose name means pleasant, the pleasant one. And that leads to the play on words in Ruth chapter 1, verse 20, where she says, my name shouldn't be Naomi. It shouldn't be pleasant. It instead should be Mara, which is actually a word, if you've been paying very close attention, it's come up already. Mara means bitter. So my name shouldn't be pleasantness. It should be bitterness. That's what she's saying there. Then you have Ruth. Ruth in Hebrew is a word that means friendship, which really is a testament to the power of friendship as displayed here in the book of Ruth. And Boaz means strength. Here's a strong man who's actually going to step in and really help to alleviate a lot of this situation. You have loyalty, and really, in the story of Ruth, the Moabitess, a real tale of incredible dedication and friendship and loyalty that through the strength of that friendship is really going to bring about great things out of an otherwise horrific situation. But Ruth in chapter 1, verse 16, but Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And here, where there seems to be nothing, this friendship and loyalty really brings out some incredible things. And so you see in the way that, some of the circumstances are really going to inform what people are saying. Chapter 1, verse 20, she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. And you have this real sense where Naomi's been through this harsh trial. She doesn't see a lot of hope out, and it's really informing this bitterness of how she sees God viewing her. And it's a real sense of grief here in hopelessness. And yet, what you have is through this faithfulness of Ruth, a real illustration of things getting turned around. And Ruth is going to be a gleaning machine. I mentioned a little bit in some of our earlier studies about the significance of gleaning. I won't dwell on it too much here because I want to finish up. But the fact that Ruth is going out, doing the work and gleaning in Boaz's field and making sure she's providing for Naomi. Then you have this interesting situation. It's one of the great moments in Ruth. Where Boaz is really going to shine forth. And that's because Naomi is looking to find a situation, a stable situation where we can find a husband, we can find a male who can really take care of this situation. Naomi hatches this plan where Ruth is going to go into Boaz's farm and uncover his feet. And I won't dwell too much on this. I don't want to explain it in too much detail, but one of the things that might make a lot more sense of a few stories in the Old Testament is that when in Hebrew you run across the term feet, it very often is a euphemism for something else, which I won't say anything more on that sense. But when you understand the story in those terms, I think it makes a lot more sense what's happening here. Ruth is really, and it's a dedication, it's an illustration of her loyalty as a friend, giving herself over completely to Boaz in order to try and protect her friend Naomi. And notice, here's a testament to the strength of Boaz, because in such circumstances, from everything you've read in Judges, you would expect you would know exactly what Boaz would do. Take advantage of Ruth and really leave everything in a much worse situation. But Boaz doesn't do that. Nor does he react in a self-righteous manner and really accuse Ruth of being loose and doing something she shouldn't. Boaz recognizes the purity of her actions in spite of the sinful context of what she's doing, recognizes her as being pure and loyal to her friend, and says, no, protect, you are you are an upstanding, honest woman. We're not doing this, but go back to Naomi, keep your virtue and go out quickly so nobody sees what's been happening here. But there's other circumstances. There's another kinsman redeemer in the line. Go out and find that person. And so here's the strength of Boaz's character, who takes this difficult situation and really, through his strength of character, makes the most of it. And a little bit of a comment on levirate marriage. This is just the context of when you have a bad situation where a husband dies off, this kinsman redeemer situation to make sure that the women are provided for. Boaz is going to make sure that that is brought into context. And that leaves us with the last thing I want to say. Just you have really put side by side here in your reading of Judges and Ruth, a story at the end of Judges that is just horrific and horrible and tells us the story of Benjamin and the Benjaminite destruction in the background of Saul. And then you have the story of Ruth with incredible strength of character and friendship and loyalty, and Boaz doing the right thing and making the best of a really horrific situation. And that's the background of the story from which we get David. And it's from Ruth and through David that we have the arrival of Christ. So recognizing I've taken up probably a little bit too much of my time, I'll hand it back over to Pastor Michael to say a few words on Samuel. Mm-hmm.
All right, just a couple things. First, we can take a few questions too before we go, but I just want to say regarding Samuel, nothing to skip. You want to read the whole thing? But notice this, there's a phrase that's used that God looks at what does it say? Man looks at the what? At the outward appearance, and God looks at the heart. That's used in the time when Samuel is about to anoint David over against Saul. And there's this battle between Saul and David. I think that sums it up, of God, the outward appearance versus the heart that God sees. The great lessons in 1 Samuel. Note, it's kind of surprising too, but note carefully, Saul is presented as someone who has lost favor with God in this scene here. And take cautionary warning at the things he does that put him out of favor. They're not scandals, although they are. To our perception, they're like, what's the big deal? What is the big deal? And meanwhile, David is a man after God's own heart. There's something about them too. I think it's a great lesson in what faith looks like. And I think we'll have a lot to say about that next week. So I would read 1 Samuel with that kind of contrast in mind. Saul and David. What are you learning about Saul and David? Saul is clearly someone who's missing the mark, and David just hits the target in this book, at least. He doesn't fall until the next book. So before we go, any questions about what we've read so far? Yeah, go ahead, Howard.
That term comes up. Is there only a single half, or are there two halves?
I think that's kind of like East and West Manasseh.
Is that referring to East and West Manasseh, or is it a half tribe as in Ephraim and Manasseh? Well, this is my question too. Is it Manasseh is interesting because it's the it is the one there's half of it on the east side of the Jordan, half on the west side. Or I often wondered, is he referring to, because Joseph had two sons and those are the half tribes. Do you know technically of that? Yeah. If it's just, if it only says half tribe of Manasseh, then I'm assuming it's just one of the
I'm guessing it's
sides.
probably just west of Manasseh.
But I'd have to check if it's half tribe of, I don't think it ever says half tribe of Ephraim though. Let's check.
Well, no, because Ephraim's all on
Yeah.
the west side of the Jordan, whereas Manasseh is split.
So I think it's geographic split. Yeah.
And one of the things that's quickly, if you're paying real close attention to geography, one of the things that's really quickly becoming apparent is that the Israelites who are still on the east side of the Jordan, things are getting pretty rough for them. They aren't going so well. It's just like how Dan, which is on the coastal plain where the Philistines are really dominant, when you get to the other side of the Jordan, that's really a place where the Ammonites, the Moabites
Yeah.
are really in power. And if you're an Israelite, things are probably not going so great for you over there.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions online there? Any questions there as well? Terrence? I feel like you're getting a good understanding of the reading. What I'm hoping as you're reading it is that it's really kind of opening up a little bit and kind of flowing like a great novel that you get caught up in and a movie almost. So it kind of unfolds that way. And maybe even feel some of the tension and the distress of it. It's more of an emotional connection. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to do it this way, as opposed to having daily readings where you're just reading a chapter each day. It doesn't give you enough flow to really feel what's happening in the scenes. And I don't know, I mean, even just listening to Judges that one day, it was like, you really feel the ugh, like I need to take a shower after watching this book. It's so filthy and so, and that's the point of it, isn't it? That's the point of it. So, all right, well, we're going to break it here.